paper, he was Gerald Elwood, an enforcer for a New Orleans cocaine ring, remembered in federal court records as the man who drove an armor-plated truck with the word homicide painted across the front. But on the streets of the Calliope, he had even more sinister name, Terror, the man who built a rolling death machine. One version of him is documented in court, but you can only find the others through rumors, and that sometimes is where you'd find the true story. And all of that reputation was built in Calliope, which at the time was functionally a war zone, but was not built to be such. It went up on the western edge of downtown New Orleans in a wave of New Deal construction, and by the raw numbers, it became one of the largest public housing complexes the city ever produced. Records trace its origins to the years around 1939 through 1941, starting with roughly 690 dwellings and expanding in the mid-1950s until it eventually held more than 500 units spread across 56 acres. That is not a housing block. That is a small city inside a city with its own economy, its own geography, and its own rules. The people who lived there never bothered with the official name. To them, it was the Calio, and it stayed the Calio long after the paperwork started calling it the B.W. Cooper Apartments. For the black families who moved in during the 1940s, a Calliope apartment often meant a genuine step up. Solid brick walls, indoor plumbing, a stable address in a segregated city that offered them very little. The complex grew its own culture inside those courtyards, and it was a serious one. Residents remember Mardi Gras Indians in full feather, doo-wop harmonies drifting between the buildings, and a neighborhood that produced an outsized share of the city's musical talent. The Neville family came out of that world. So did a long line of New Orleans performers, and later a generation of rap figures who would carry the Calliope's name far past the city limits. This was a place with pride and a story about itself, and that matters because the violence that came later did not erase any of it. It layered on top of it. That double identity is the key to everything that followed, because across the same decades, the Calliope built two national reputations at once. One was musical, which included a list of talent that ran from the Neville family through the bounce and rap explosion of the 1990s, when labels born a few miles away turned New Orleans project life into a sound that sold across the country. The other was criminal. To the newspapers and the police, the Calliope in the crack years was shorthand for danger, one of the most violent stretches of a violent city, a name that tended to reach print only when someone had been shot. Those two reputations were never really separate. The same artist who made the neighborhood famous had grown up inside its drug life, watched its enforcers work, and carried its stories into their music. Years later, when the legend of an armored truck and a man called Terror needed somewhere to travel, it would move along the exact channels the Calliope's musical fame had already built. The neighborhood's talent for turning its own life into narrative is a large part of why a local enforcer became a figure people 3 decades and 1,000 miles away would still argue about. Fear and folklore came out of the same courtyards, and they were always going to end up braided together. By the 1970s, the Calliope had become a national reference point for something almost no outsider expected from a project this size. Tenants were trained to run the development themselves in one of the country's most ambitious experiments in resident management. A slow, negotiated process that would eventually place day-to-day control of the complex in the hands of the people who lived there. For a moment, the Calliope looked like a model. Residents organized tenant patrols, ran block parties, and pushed back against the idea that a housing project could only ever be a problem to be managed. Then the ground shifted underneath all of it. Industry left New Orleans. The blue-collar jobs that had once anchored families in places like the Calliope disappeared, and the money that used to move through the neighborhood thinned out year after year. Poverty deepened, buildings decayed, and the city let the decay run. By the late 1980s, the same courtyards that had once carried doo-wop had become open-air drug markets, operating in the shadow of buildings that were falling apart. Crack cocaine reached New Orleans the way it reached almost every American city in that decade: fast, cheap, catastrophically profitable, and violent. And the Calliope, dense and poor and largely written off by the outside economy, sat directly in its path. What filled that vacuum was organized. The drug trade that took over the Calliope had structure, hierarchy, and a chain of command, and the crew that came to dominate it operated less like a street gang than like a company. At the top sat Glenn Metz, known on the street as OG, and his wife Danielle. According to the government's later filings, the Metz organization moved a staggering volume of product. Prosecutors put the figure at around 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, laundered its money through legitimate-looking businesses, and maintained a layer of men whose only assignment was force. Federal prosecutors would eventually describe the whole apparatus as a criminal enterprise. Every enterprise like that has an enforcement arm, a set of people responsible for making sure debts get paid, rivals stay off the block, and shipments arrive intact. That is where Gerald Elwood belongs in the record. The court files know him first by his legal name and a short list of aliases. In the federal paperwork, he is Gerald Elwood, documented under additional names including Keith McCoy and Homie, a man who moved through the system under more than one identity. Multiple names is not a small detail in a case like this, it is a working method, the tradecraft of a man who did not want a single paper trail leading back to him. But the name that follows him through nearly every document is the one the street gave him long before any prosecutor did: Knapp. When the courts later described exactly what Knapp did for the Mets organization, they did not reach for vague language. A federal appeals court, reviewing the case years afterward, placed Elwood alongside a small group of co-defendants: Gennaro Arthur, Marlo Helmstetter, Noah Moore Jr., and Shane Sterling, and identified their function inside the operation as gunmen, enforcers, and men who acquired and stored the firearms the organization ran on. By the record's account, he sat on the enforcement side of the business, muscle rather than management. His value to the Mets organization was violence, or the credible threat of it, and the tools of that trade. That is the documented Gerald Elwood, a convicted enforcer for a large New Orleans cocaine ring, tied by the courts to guns and to the protection of the drug trade. The Calliope remembers a different man, and the difference is the whole story. In the oral history of the neighborhood, Knapp Elwood is terror. He is described as a top hitman, a figure who did not merely work for the drug trade but ruled the block through fear, a man credited in some retellings with dozens of killings. It is worth being precise about that label, because precision is exactly what a story like his tends to lose. The name Terror does not appear in any of the official documents that identify him. The paperwork uses Knapp, Keith McCoy, and Homie. Terror is a street inheritance, a name the neighborhood assigned and kept, one that tells you more about how residents experienced him than about anything a prosecutor ever proved. It is a real name in the sense that people used it. It is not a name any record can confirm. Almost nothing about Elwood's early life survives in a form that can be checked. The court records begin with him already grown, already armed, already deep inside the organization. The community's account fills in the years before, describing a young man who came up inside the Calliope and drifted into the drug trade as a teenager, the way a great many young men in that world and that decade did. Those details are plausible and consistent with everything around him, but they live in memory rather than in any file, and they should be held that way, as the neighborhood's understanding of one of its own, not as documented biography. What can be said with confidence is this: by the start of the 1990s, Gerald Knapp Elwood was a functioning part of one of the most violent drug organizations in New Orleans, in a role the courts would later define in plain terms as gunman and enforcer. Everything the street would build on top of that foundation, the killings, the fear, the legend of an unstoppable machine on wheels, starts from a real man doing a real job for a real enterprise, and the object that turned him from an enforcer into a myth was parked outside. The clearest, most reliable image the record gives us of Gerald Elwood comes from a single night, and it is the night that made the truck famous. On July 12, 1991, sheriff's deputies in St. John the Baptist Parish, a stretch of Louisiana just up the river from New Orleans, were running surveillance on a Holiday Inn in the town of La Place as part of an ongoing narcotics investigation. They had reasons to be watching. One room had drawn their attention because the people inside had paid cash for a single night, flashed large rolls of bills, and been making a stream of long-distance phone calls, the profile of a crew passing through on business, not guests on vacation. A deputy watched a man walk out to a Nissan Maxima parked near the room, pull a bag from the car, and carry it back inside. A short time later, 4 men came out of that room together and split between 2 vehicles. 2 of them, both juveniles at the time, got into the Nissan and set the bag in the back seat, with one of them at the wheel. The other 2, Gerald Elwood and a man named William Barnes, walked to something that did not blend into a hotel parking lot. It was a black pickup truck, and it had been armored. Across the front of it was painted a single word: Homicide. Down the side ran a second phrase: Villain in black. Behind the wheel sat Elwood, The appellate decision that later reviewed the case records the vehicle plainly. A black armor-plated pickup marked with homicide on the front and villain in black on the side. This is not a detail lifted from a rumor thread or a YouTube interview. It is in the federal court record, described by the officers who saw it and preserved by the court that reviewed the case. Whatever the legend added later, this part is fact. The two vehicles pulled out of the hotel lot. The Nissan in front, the truck behind it, and almost immediately both ran a stop sign and then a red light. That gave the deputies their opening. When Deputy Franks pulled the Nissan over to the shoulder, the truck did something no ordinary driver does. It pulled in and stopped behind the deputy's car and turned its lights off. To officers working a stop in the dark, an armored vehicle sliding into position at their back and going dark reads as a threat, not a coincidence. A second patrol car, carrying deputies Mitchell and Bazile, moved in behind the truck to pin it in place. The surveillance the deputies had been running from a distance became a confrontation on the side of the road. What they found inside the two vehicles turned a traffic stop into a federal case. Neither of the young men in the Nissan carried identification, and both were wearing beepers, standard equipment in the drug trade of that era. The bag in the back seat held cocaine, more than 2 kilograms of it, wrapped into over 200 separate packets, packaging that points squarely at distribution rather than personal use. The truck was its own inventory of intent. After finding that neither man in the truck had any identification, deputies looked inside, saw a Glock pistol, and then turned up a .38 revolver beneath the passenger seat, along with a cellular phone, a pager, and a paper bag holding plastic wrappings marked with cocaine residue that fell out as one of the men climbed down. All 4 were arrested. When officers followed the trail back to the hotel room, they found a triple beam scale, more plastic bags, and over $5,000 in cash. A working packaging station for a cocaine operation. Set the pieces beside each other, and the picture the government would argue in court comes into focus. A car carrying 2 kilograms of cocaine divided for sale. An armored truck riding directly behind it, carrying 2 guns and 2 armed men. A hotel room set up to weigh and bag product. The prosecution cast the truck as security rather than transportation. An escort rolling behind the drugs to protect them from anyone who might try to take them on the road. The men inside it, by that reading, were guards, and the vehicle was their fortress. Not everyone in that group was tried the same way. One of the young men in the Nissan, Ernest Marrero, was a juvenile at the time, and the government had to fight to try him as an adult at all. The federal law sets out a specific process for that, requiring a judge to weigh a set of factors before moving a juvenile into adult court. At his transfer hearing, the district court concluded that the seriousness of the offense, his record, and the failure of past efforts to turn him around outweighed the arguments for keeping him in the juvenile system, and ruled that trying him as an adult served the interest of justice. The court noted that the quantity of cocaine involved was far beyond anything a first-timer would be handling, and that the young man had been moving through the world without meaningful supervision. He would stand trial as an adult, and the drug economy that pulled him in would follow him into a federal courtroom. The convictions came down across the board. Elwood and Barnes were found guilty of conspiracy and of possessing cocaine with intent to distribute. Marrero was convicted on the possession count, and all 3 were convicted of using and carrying firearms in connection with a drug trafficking crime. Elwood drew the heaviest sentence of the 3, roughly 10 years on the drug counts, followed by a mandatory 5-year term on the gun charge that the law required to be served consecutively, stacked on top rather than folded in. Marrero's defense is worth pausing on because it shows how thin the line between defendants could get on a night like that. At argument, his lawyer claimed the officers had mistaken him for the other juvenile, that it was the other young man, not Marrero, who had carried the drugs. There was a wrinkle of evidence behind it. At booking, the 2 young men were dressed differently than the officer's account suggested, with the clothing that matched the description of the man carrying the bag turning out to belong to the other juvenile, not Marrero. The argument collapsed on Marrero's own testimony, in which he admitted retrieving a bag from the Nissan and bringing it into the room. The jury had beepers, a scale, packaged cocaine, and 2 armed men following in an armored truck, and from all of it drew the obvious conclusion. The other men in the convoy were pulled in by the same logic, and the way the law reached them says a great deal about how the whole operation was understood. William Barnes, riding armed in the truck behind the drugs, argued that the government had nothing on him beyond his friendship with the others and the fact that he happened to be present. The courts have a standard answer to the mere presence defense, and it is that presence counts for far more when the circumstances around it are damning. Barnes was armed, following the cocaine from the hotel in an armored truck, and the jury was entitled to read that as an agreement to help protect the load. A minor part in a conspiracy is still a part. Marrero was reached from the opposite direction. He rode in the Nissan, not the truck, and never had his hands on the guns at all, yet he was convicted on the firearms count anyway, because as a member of the conspiracy, he could be held responsible for the weapons his co-conspirators carried in furtherance of it, on the reasoning that with that much cocaine in play, it was foreseeable the load would be guarded with guns. The armored truck did not just implicate the two men inside it. In the eyes of the law, it implicated the entire group moving in formation around it, and it turned the convoy into a single armed enterprise. The Fourth Amendment fight that came afterward is where the truck's legal significance sharpened. Passengers in a car they don't own generally have no standing to challenge a search of it, which knocked out most of the defendant's objections to the cocaine found in the Nissan. Elwood was different because he was driving the truck, and the truck was his to contest. The court found it did not matter. The Glock was in plain view on the seat. The officers had a legitimate reason to look inside once the men produced no identification, and Elwood's later consent to search both the truck and the hotel room followed from a valid arrest. The armor that was supposed to make the truck untouchable did nothing to keep the evidence inside it out of a courtroom. There was one more piece of the truck's story that surfaced at trial, and it points ahead to everything the legend would become. Prosecutors brought in evidence of weapons seized from Elwood's home the year before, a cache that included firearms and a bulletproof vest, which the prosecution described to the jury in terms meant to land hard, characterizing it as an arsenal. The defense fought its admission, and the appeals court flagged real concern about parading that much weaponry in front of a jury when the case in front of them involved only a single gun, each carried by Elwood and Barnes, and sent that piece of the case back to the trial judge to justify on the record. It was a technical remand, and it left the conviction standing, but it captures the pattern that runs through Elwood's entire story. The image of the man, heavily armed, armored, dangerous, always threatened to outrun the specific facts of what could be proven against him. So this much is anchored. The truck was real. It was armored. It carried those words. It carried guns, and Gerald Elwood was driving it. That is where the confirmable ends and the folklore takes over. Start with the name. On the street, and across the network of channels and forums that trade in New Orleans, hood history, the truck is almost never called by its slogans. It is called the Rolling Death Machine, a phrase that lands like the title of an action movie and carries the same energy. That name never appears in any court document, any police report, or any contemporary account of the 1991 arrest. The primary sources give you homicide and villain in black and nothing else. Rolling Death Machine arrived later, applied in the retelling, a nickname built to make an already frightening object sound mythic. It is a folk title, and it deserves to be treated as one. Then there is the question buried in this whole story's premise. Did he build it? The court record is careful in a way the legend is not. It establishes more than once that Elwood drove the armored pickup. It never says he designed it, welded the plating, or assembled it in a garage. The street version fills that silence with a specific and satisfying image. Knapp the craftsman, personally building a homemade tank to rule the projects. That image may be partly true. Someone armored that truck, and Elwood was the man behind its wheel, tied to the vehicle closely enough that the community naturally credited him with its creation. But the jump from drove it to built it is exactly the kind of jump the record cannot support. In some tellings, the construction gets credited to a co-defendant instead, or to an unnamed welder working for the organization. The honest answer is that the builder's identity is not established, and the confident claim that Elwood himself made it is a story, not a fact. The truck's specifications get the same treatment. Oral accounts describe bulletproof glass, gun ports, a heavy reinforced suspension, sometimes gun turrets, sometimes sirens or booming speakers. Even the make of the vehicle drifts from teller to teller. One version remembers a GMC dually, another a Ford. The only features the record confirms are the armor plating and the guns physically found inside. Gun ports, turrets, and the more elaborate additions are unverified, and the fact that people cannot agree on the model of the truck is itself a tell. When a story keeps growing details it can't keep straight, those details are usually being added by the tellers, not preserved from the object. None of that makes the truck less important. If anything, it explains why the legend formed at all. Picture the real object as the neighborhood saw it. A bulletproof pickup with Homicide painted across the nose, rolling slowly through a public housing complex, trailed by armed men, turning up at drop-offs and block parties and funerals. You do not need turrets to remember that. The truck was designed to be seen and to be feared. And it worked so completely that it outlived the man who drove it and hardened into folklore. That reputation did not fade with the case either. It hardened in the courts too. Decades later, when Glenn Metz asked a federal judge to release him early, the judge reached back to that same armored truck. A member of the organization openly driving a bulletproof vehicle marked with those slogans, as proof of how brazen and arrogant the operation had become. 30 years after the fact, the truck was still doing work in a courtroom, this time as evidence of a mindset. Because that folklore did not grow in a quiet place. The Calliope in these years was the front line of a drug war, and the truck was one weapon in it. The Metz organization did not hold the territory unopposed. It competed with other crews for control of the New Orleans market, including gangs tied to other projects across the city, and the competition was lethal. Among the names that recur in the neighborhood's memory of that era is Sam Clay, called Scully, remembered on the street as an earlier power in the Calliope drug trade, a supplier whose reputation sat somewhere between godfather and warlord. What the record adds to the folklore is a killing. A federal superseding indictment later alleged that members of the Metz organization murdered Samuel Scully Clay in the summer of 1987 to remove a rival and take the market for themselves. That is an allegation from a charging document, not a proven verdict against any specific triggerman. And the indictment does not name who fired the shots. Street lore sometimes places Elwood or one of the other enforcers at that scene. The record does not, and neither should this account. The enforcer whose reputation looms largest in that war is not Elwood at all, and his story matters here as a warning about how these legends bleed into one another. Gennaro Arthur, known as Meatball, was widely feared, and when he was finally caught, the details were almost cinematic. He was arrested working as a dishwasher at a restaurant in Seattle, and marshals said they suspected him of involvement in as many as 70 killings, including a machine gun ambush on the Earhart Expressway, and described his willingness to shoot a witness in the legs to keep others in line. That figure, 70, is a law enforcement suspicion, not a courtroom tally, and it should be read as one, but it points at something crucial. The Calliope War produced more than one feared gunman, and some of the killings the street now hangs on terror may in fact belong to Arthur or to others in the same crew. When a neighborhood carries the memory of dozens of murders and a roster of frightening men, that memory tends to compress everything down into a single towering figure. Elwood's legend may be carrying weight that was never only his to hold. That is the war the truck rolled through, a fight over the New Orleans cocaine trade waged by an organization that moved product by the ton and answered threats with guns, drawing in rivals, victims, and eventually a multi-agency federal task force built on wiretaps, surveillance, and informants. Elwood's role in it, by the record, was to be one of those guns, and the truck was his badge of office. Within a year of that night in Lay Place, the federal government moved to take the whole enterprise apart. If the 1991 arrest was the first thread, then the federal case was the whole cloth. Elwood's night in Lay Place produced a conviction on its own, but it was a single incident in a far larger operation, and the government's next move treated it that way. In 1992, federal prosecutors brought the case that would define nearly everyone in this story. The indictment and what the courts filed as the Tolliver and Metz prosecution swept up the leadership and the enforcers together. Glenn Metz, Danielle Metz, Gerald Elwood, Gennaro Arthur, Marlo Helmstetter, Noah Moore Jr., Shane Sterling, and others, and charged them under the federal racketeering and continuing criminal enterprise statutes with running a drug organization that moved roughly 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, laundered its money, and committed murders and attempted murders to protect its territory. This was one of the first major federal prosecutions to treat a New Orleans drug crew as an organized enterprise rather than a loose scatter of dealers, and it was built to bring the entire structure down at once. The trial ran into the mid-1990s and ended in convictions on most counts. On the piece that is cleanly documented, the appeals court's later opinion confirms that Elwood and his fellow enforcers were convicted of firearms violations connected to the numerous weapons kept at their residences. The heavier charges, the murders and attempted murders carried out in aid of the racketeering enterprise, were assigned to specific defendants, and news accounts and legal summaries have long reported that Elwood was among those convicted of killings committed for the organization, alongside Arthur and Helmstetter. Those particular murder convictions come from secondary accounts rather than a court file that can be read directly here, so they sit in the category of widely reported but not independently confirmed. That distinction is the difference between what this account can state outright and what it can only relay. It is easy to say Elwood killed for the Mets organization because the enforcer role and the environment make it likely, and because everyone who tells the story says so. It is harder and more honest to admit that the specific homicide counts against him are not something the accessible documents lay out. The names attached to those alleged killings show how far the story runs past what can be pinned down. Secondary accounts of the case list particular victims tied to the Mets enforcers, men remembered in reporting and legal summaries by names such as Frank Walker, Eric Wilson, and Michael Jones, as homicides carried out to protect the organization's business, because the underlying opinions that would confirm exactly who was convicted of which killing are not readily accessible. Those names sit in the same uncertain space as the sentence figures: reported, plausible, consistent with everything around them, and not something this account can present as settled. What is clear is the shape of the war they came out of. The Mets organization did not build its territory in a vacuum. It pushed against rival crews across New Orleans, including factions rooted in other housing projects and an earlier generation of Calliope suppliers, and the documented killing of Scully Clay is one example of how that competition tended to get settled, with a body cited years later in a federal charging document. The full ledger of who killed whom in the Calliope may never be public. The general fact that the neighborhood's drug economy was enforced with murder is not in dispute, and it is the ground the legend of terror grew out of. The sentences follow the same rule as the number that circulates in the neighborhood and across online write-ups is that Gerald Elwood received 3 life sentences plus 30 years, with Arthur and Helmstetter drawing comparably crushing terms. That figure is consistent across the informal sources and fits the scale of the case, but it comes from secondary retellings rather than an accessible court judgment, and it should be carried as a strong report, not a settled fact. What the court records do confirm is that the life sentences handed down in this prosecution held, surviving the appeals that came after. For the people at the center of this organization, the federal case was, for practical purposes, final. There was one real opening, and it closed most of the way. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowed what it meant to use a firearm under federal law, a shift that forced courts across the country to re-examine gun convictions built on the old, broader standard. On that basis, the appeals court revisited this case and vacated some of the firearms counts against these defendants, but declined to disturb the life sentences because other convictions still held them in place. A door opened, a few charges fell away, and the men stayed exactly where they were. The people around Elwood scattered toward very different fates. Danielle Metz, sentenced to life alongside the rest, became a national example of how severe drug-era sentencing had grown. And in 2016, her sentence was commuted, and she walked out after more than 2 decades inside. Glenn Metz stayed in, and his repeated bids for compassionate release were denied, with the court returning each time to the violence of the organization and to that armored truck as its reason. Gennaro Arthur, the dishwasher marshal suspected in dozens of killings, was convicted and buried under his own stack of time. As for Gerald Elwood, there is no accessible record of a successful appeal or a release. By every available account, he remains incarcerated in a federal facility, one of the last living threads of the Calliope drug war still held inside the system that finally caught up with it, which leaves the gap this entire story lives in, the space between what the courts wrote down and what the streets remember. Line the 2 versions up and the seams show at every joint. The record gives you Knapp, Keith McCoy, Homie. The neighborhood gives you Terror, a name no document ever used. The record gives you a truck marked Homicide and Villain in Black. The neighborhood gives you the Rolling Death Machine, a title invented somewhere in the retelling. The record establishes that Elwood drove an armored pickup. The neighborhood insists he built it, complete with gun ports and turrets the paperwork never mentions. The record confirms he was an enforcer convicted on drugs and guns. The neighborhood credits him with dozens of murders, a count no accessible file supports, and that may in part belong to Meatball Arthur or to other men in the same crew. At almost every point where the legend runs hottest, the documentation runs thinnest, and the thin spots are precisely where the imagination went to work. There are real contradictions inside the folklore too, not just gaps. The street sometimes remembers Elwood running alongside Sam Scully Clay as partners or protege and mentor. The record points the other way, since the Mets organization Elwood worked for is the same organization accused of murdering Scully in 1987 to clear him out of the market. A rivalry, not a partnership. Another figure the neighborhood ties to him, a man remembered as Terrell Turbo Sterling, has no documented connection to the case at all. The only Sterling in the official files is a Shane Sterling, listed among the enforcers, possibly a relative, and possibly no relation. These are the kinds of knots that form when a story travels by word of mouth for 30 years. Names blur, roles swap, allies and enemies trade places, and the version that survives is the one that makes the best story, not the one that best matches the file. That pattern is not unique to Elwood. It is how a neighborhood metabolizes its own violence. When the official story is locked inside sealed transcripts and hard-to-reach opinions, memory does the rest of the work. And memory prefers a single towering villain to a messy roster of interchangeable gunmen. So the killings consolidate onto one man. The truck grows armor it may never have had. The enforcer becomes a mastermind, and a man who drove security for a cocaine ring turns into a folk figure who ruled the projects from behind bulletproof glass. The exaggeration is not a lie exactly. It is a kind of accounting, a way of assigning a face and a name to a decade of fear that otherwise had no single author. The story kept moving because the city gave it a place to live. New Orleans hip-hop grew partly out of these same blocks, and the Calliope produced a run of artists who came up watching this world firsthand. The specifics of Elwood's case rarely surface in commercial records. Naming a real enforcer in a released song carries obvious risk, but the atmosphere he moved through runs all through that music, in the imagery of armored cars and murder blocks and men who could not be touched. Online, listeners sometimes read those lines as coded references to the Calliope's real enforcers and their real hardware, though those readings stay speculative by nature. What is not speculative is the second life the story found on the internet. A network of channels devoted to New Orleans street history has kept Elwood's name in active circulation, running interviews with former residents and family members of the era's major figures, retelling the story of the bulletproof truck for audiences who were born after it was seized and hauled away. Those videos are anecdote, not archived, and the accounts inside them shift from teller to teller and channel to channel. But they are the single biggest reason a man convicted in the 1990s is still being searched for, argued over, and mythologized right now. The neighborhood carries the story in gentler forms too. Longtime residents describe the truck as common knowledge, something that used to sit outside the projects like a standing warning, a fixture everyone in the Callio knew and steered around. Some of them pushed back on the legend, insisting it grew in the telling. Both reactions are part of the same living memory, the ordinary way a community keeps and argues over its own history when the official record won't do it for them. Underneath the folklore runs a quieter, more reliable current. After Hurricane Katrina, the brick buildings of the Calliope survived the flooding and were demolished anyway, cleared for mixed-income redevelopment, and the community that had lived there for generations was scattered across the city and beyond. As part of the agreement that allowed the demolition, an oral history project was created to record residents' memories of the place before it disappeared entirely. Those recordings are mostly about ordinary life, the music, the kinship, the pride of a neighborhood that outsiders only ever heard about through crime reports, but the violence lives at the edges of them, and the armored truck is part of what people carried out with them when the walls came down. When the last buildings fell, the neighborhood marked it the way it had marked everything else, with a block party and music, laying the place to rest on its own terms. Those recordings are not the only place the Calliope has written its own history. Community-driven projects built around the same demolition, a museum exhibit, and a documentary assembled from residents' testimony set out to preserve the neighborhood's memory of itself as something far richer than a crime map, centered on family, music, and the daily work of getting by in a place the rest of the city had mostly given up on. They do not dwell on men like Elwood, but the drug war lives in the margins of that work too, because it lived in the margins of everyone's life there, and you cannot record what the Calliope was without also recording the fear that ran beside the pride, That is the tension the whole legend expresses in miniature. The official record remembers Gerald Elwood as a defendant, a set of counts, a sentence, a docket number. The music remembers the world he moved through. The oral histories remember the neighborhood he moved through it in. And in the overlap of all three, the armored truck keeps rolling, because it is the single image that belongs to every version of the story at once. The court's evidence of arrogance, the rapper's symbol of untouchability, and the resident's memory of a warning parked at the edge of the block. That is the real weight of the rolling death machine. It sits at the intersection of a documented crime and a community's memory of itself, and both are true at once. The court file is accurate. A real man named Gerald Elwood really did drive a real armored truck marked with the word homicide, really did serve as an enforcer for a drug organization that moved cocaine by the ton, really was convicted, and really was buried in the federal system. The neighborhood's version is also honest in its own way, because it records how that man and that truck felt to the people who had to live in front of them, and it preserves a fear that no docket number could ever capture. The record measures what could be proven. The legend measures what was survived. Somewhere between the two is the actual Gerald Knapp Elwood, an armed enforcer with an intimidating truck, whose reputation the years have inflated, whose crimes the accessible records only partly reveal, and whose legend has run so far ahead of the man that the truck now carries a name he probably never called it. He built or drove a machine designed to be remembered, and it did the one thing it was built to do. The projects it terrorized are gone, demolished and paved over into something else. The legend is still running,